Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to you all. I'm Philippa Houghton-Chapman, and it's a great pleasure today to welcome Phoebe Taptiklis. Is that right? And Phoebe joined in our He Kaingoranga research meetings on and off for a number of years. So we've seen the doctorate on which her work is placed take shape. And we always thought it was an extremely interesting and important thesis. And we were delighted, which she was doing through the Centre for Public Health Research in Massey. And we were a bit delighted that she made through the link with us. And then that she got the job in the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, actually translating the research she's done into setting standards, which is the subjects actually of our latest HRC program. So we were very delighted about that, and we're delighted that she's going to distill her work for us today, for the people who are in the room here, and also there are some online, Cara, and people online. So no further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Philippa, for that lovely introduction. Yes, I'm going to do my best today to take you through the work that I've done for my PhD, which is looking at the causes of dampness in mould, or drivers of dampness in mould, within 3 New Zealand house condition surveys. So I'll do my best not to put you to sleep, like no guarantees. So a little bit of background about the Brand's house condition surveys. They've been conducted approximately every 5 years since 1994. They're a very detailed survey, so there's over 1,500 individual aspects of the house are measured, and most of those aspects are described both by what type of feature of the house and the condition of that feature. The assessors are all construction professionals, but there are no behaviour or health components to these assessments. Although the most recent, the 2015 one, did have a supplement which was designed and funded by ECA on heating behaviours. But other than that, we don't know. So I talk a lot about ventilation, particularly in this talk here, but when we're talking about that, we're talking about the presence of fans, not whether or not they were actually used. So the research for my PhD has taken the 3 most recent of these house condition surveys conducted 2005, 2010 and 2015, and the total sample of all 3 surveys is 1,616 houses. They're all discrete samples, so no houses were included in more than one survey. There's a few important differences I need to describe between the 3 surveys. So firstly, in terms of sample strategy, from the 2010 survey onwards, a complex sample design was created so that the sample was representative of New Zealand housing stock in terms of both geography and tenure. So, and on that line, the 2005 sample did not include any rental houses. They're all owner-occupied houses. The 2005 survey was a national survey, but didn't use the complex sampling structure, so it's not quite so representative. Also in 2010, assessor training was put together to improve the consistency between different assessors' measurements, and also I should mention that musty odour was added as a dampness indicator in 2010, so that wasn't present in the 2005 survey. And another important difference that we're going to go into in a bit of detail now is that the 2010 survey only did a large proportion of the surveys during the colder, wetter months of spring and winter. And so in order to look at whether that had an important impact on our data, we also used the NIWA CLIFlow database, which is a great resource, accessible free to all researchers. What we did is we located the closest weather station to each house and extracted the 24-hour rainfall, total rainfall in millimetres, and the 24-hour daily high temperature for the 30 days up to and including the date of the survey. And we also thought about these climate zones and broke our samples down into the climate zones, which these are broadly analogous to the climate zones which are used for insulation regulation in the building code. The main difference being that in the building code, the Central Plateau region here of the North Island is included in climate zone 3 with the South Island, but we didn't have very many houses in that area, so we just went for a slightly simplified version. And so this first lot of numbers to look at here shows that, that in fact this seasonal difference between the surveys did have a big difference in terms of how much, what was happening climatically. So as described, we see here in 2010, 90% of the sample was conducted during winter and spring. So I made these seasons from the month that the survey was conducted. So summer is December, January, February, autumn, March, April, May, June, July, August for winter, and spring, September, October, November. So you can see that 90% of 2010 sample was done from June through to November, as opposed to 98 done at the opposite end of the year in 2005. And then if we go down to look at the rain and temperature outcomes, we see that that did actually have a big impact, and that the 2010 sample had a lot more houses which were in these higher rainfall categories and the colder temperature categories, and we'll see how that plays out in the analyses. These were the dampness outcomes that I used as the basis of my analyses. We've got floor joist moisture content and roof joist moisture content, which were measured with a two-prong electrical resistor type thing called a protometer, and that gives you a measurement of moisture content and a percent of moisture content. We also had mould. Mould was assessed in these, is assessed in the house condition surveys for each room independently on a scale, on the scale shown here. But for this analysis, we've decided mostly to focus, well, we did mould in the whole house, but we wanted to focus particularly on mould that was present in living and bedrooms for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that the health research has, some of the health research has demonstrated that this mould in living in bedrooms is more significant in terms of health outcomes. And secondly, by excluding rooms that have plumbing in them, then you're excluding houses where the mould might be caused by, you know, a specific event or factor of that house that's not broadly descriptive of the house overall. We've also got subjective dampness. This is also a bit different to how dampness has been reported in a lot of the international literature, where dampness tends to be reported with visual cues, such as patches, damp patches or stains. This damp measure was actually a subjective sense feeling of dampness that the assessors gave to it. And musty odour, as we said, 2010 onwards. And we can see that there's actually not, they're quite low levels of all of these outcomes, particularly 2005, we remember was done all in summer. Only 4% of the houses had any mould in living in bedrooms, and a little bit higher in 2010 and 2015, but still not enormous compared to other surveys that you may have seen. And 2010's got a bit more, a quarter of the sample had some dampness, but musty odour was not particularly common anywhere. So, and just some images to show. So this is across the year from January through December, and the 3 different surveys. And the line in the middle of each of these boxes obviously represents the mean moisture measurement in that month. And what I think is quite interesting about this is that the moisture measurements from September, August through November actually seem to be the most consistent in terms of the mean, and even the outliers are less extreme, whereas the hottest, driest months from January through April appear to have the most difference from year to year, as well as the biggest spread of the measurements, which is not what I expected. You can see this gap in the middle of the year. In the coldest, wettest months, few measurements were taken. Similar story in the roof joists, but even more consistency. There's very similar measurements taken throughout the year and across the 3 surveys. So to briefly describe the methods for the main part of my analysis, which was, perhaps I should step back and give a background of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about the main analysis, but also when you're doing these kind of things, you tend to do quite a bit of exploration. So we're going to dig into some of the other questions that I looked at, as well as the main question of my PhD, where I did start with a hypothesis, which was that the condition of the exterior envelope of the house, so the claddings, would predict the indoor dampness and mould. And so this is the method that we use to assess that hypothesis. So how we went about this, for each individual moisture outcome, we started off with a univariate analysis of firstly, we pulled out around about 62 variables that we predicted were plausibly could be related to dampness or mould. And these included a few factors of the site as well, like the slope, the shade, and on the exterior, all the exterior features, the underfloor, what have you, and inside presence of ventilation. So at this stage, then the next stage was to build a multivariate model, which at this point I built a separate model for each outcome. And then we decided to go on and do a third stage of the analysis where we created some aggregated domains, which I'll explain in a minute. But first we'll just have a quick look at some of the results from that first multivariate stage. So we've just got 3 of the outcomes here: dampness, musty odour and mould, this time in the whole house we're looking at here. And so this model was just specifically for mould. This model was just specifically for musty odour. Obviously, there were some other variables. This is just a selection of the variables that were included in those models. And it starts to look like, the hypothesis is bearing out somewhat. We can see some strong associations with window condition, with increased odds of 6 times the odds of having a dampness in 2015 and 2.5 times the odds of having dampness in 2004, that should say 2005, if your window condition is poorer. So just for the detail on that, the window was given a condition rating, a 5-point condition rating from excellent, good, moderate, poor, serious. So, and I binned that into a binary of excellent and good versus the other 3. So if you were moderate, poor, or serious, you had 2.4, 2.5 to 6 times the odds of dampness, 5 times the odds of musty odour, 2.5 to 5 times the odds of musty odour, and 1 to 7 times the odds of mould in the whole house. And we can see that there's also some fairly strong associations with wall cladding, with this condition of the spouting, and even exterior wall paint deterioration, which was the point that I really started out this exploration from. So I was very happy to see that. So, and at the end here, we've got presence of a range hood. And for those who are not familiar with odds ratios, just to point out that this is a reduction in effect. So anything below 1 is a reduction in odds, and anything above 1 is an increase of odds. So we can see that this demonstrates a 70% reduction in odds of dampness in houses that had a range hood present, and an 80% and a 90% reduction in odds of musty odour in 2015 in houses with a range hood. So, but you can see, so we can see some quite strong results, but there's a lack of consistency, and so that was one of the reasons for wanting to go into the next stage of the analysis and create these aggregate domains. So we sort of went through them to see what we could lump together, and that might have, where we might be able to look for a sort of linear effect if things are having the similar factors are having a similar effect. So we created a ventilation domain. How this worked was that each house was given a score of 1 if it had a range hood present, and 0 if it didn't, and another 1 if it had a bathroom fan present, and 0 if it didn't, and 1 if it had a clothes dryer present, and 0 if it didn't. So every house would have a score on the aggregate ventilation domain of 0 to 3. And likewise for the subfloor domain, we used presence of ponding or leaks under the house, absence of ground covering, and insufficient ventilation. Insulation, we used the 3 types of insulation: no roof insulation, no underfloor insulation, and no wall cavity insulation. There were not many houses across all 3 surveys that didn't have any insulation whatsoever. So anyway, and the envelope condition, I used these 5 factors here. Again, this is describing that 5-point condition rating that we've reduced to a binary outcome. So each house got a score of 1 if the roof cladding was rated moderate to poor, and 0 if it was good or excellent, and on it goes. And so this analysis allowed us to do a couple of things. Firstly, it allowed us to look for what's called a dose-response relationship, where you could sort of see a linear effect, where as insulation types increase, does mould increase in a linear fashion. And the other thing that it meant was that I could have one model that I tested against all the outcomes to look at what the differences were there between this model's ability to predict the different dampness outcomes. So firstly, you can see that tenure rental, being a tenant, is associated with an approximate doubling of odds of most of these dampness outcomes, apart from the moisture measurements. Not significant in all of them, but nevertheless, a fair amount of consistency in the effect sizes. Ventilation domain, here we can see, so in 2010, houses that had one of 3 types of ventilation had a 60% reduction in odds, 60% reduction if you had 2 types, and an 80% reduction in odds of living in bedroom mould if you had 3 out of the 3 types. And this p-value at the bottom here is to test for the linear trend of this relationship. Is that linear trend significant? So the individual categories are statistically significant, represented by these stars, but the linear trend is also statistically significant. Again, we see dose-response relationship here in 2015 of the odds of living in bedroom mould reducing in a linear fashion with increased number of fans in the house. Not quite as, oh no, that's also the odds, also dose response, yeah, so the ventilation domain seems quite consistent across the, most of these outcomes it does demonstrate a dose response reduction in odds of all these dampness outcomes, and the trends are significant. But it doesn't appear to be related to floor joist moisture. The insulation, we've got a very strong dose-response relationship in 2005. This is not significant, but it's still a dose-response relationship. And here again, and we see with musty odour, we also see, so this is houses that have three of three types of insulation are used as the reference category. Houses that only have 2 out of the 3 are 6 times more likely to have living and bedroom mould in 2005, 7 times more likely if they've only got 1 out of 3, and 11 times more likely to have living and bedroom mould if they don't have any insulation at all. The fact that these are not quite as tidy relationships as these may partly be to do with the way the data is spread out, because these bottom categories had very small numbers in them. Again, no clear relationship with the moisture measurements. And although the statistical significance isn't quite as strong with dampness, each of these surveys did demonstrate the dose response increase in odds of dampness with fewer types of insulation. And the subfloor domain we see is quite interesting, doesn't appear to be related to living in bedroom mould, possibly related to musty odour, but seems to be quite strongly related to indoor dampness. So that's quite interesting, because that's a difference between the visible mould and the dampness. Subfloor appears to be related to dampness, but not mould. Again, here it's quite strongly related to the floor joist moisture measurements, which is just as well. And here's the hypothesis, appears to be borne out fairly strongly here. So I binned them even smaller, so that houses that had none or one of those types of envelope defects, moderate to serious, 2 to 3, 4 to 5. And you see the houses that have 4 to 5 types of envelope defect, serious or poor, went from 2.5 to 5 times the odds of living and bedroom mould, statistically significant trend. Similar relationship in musty odour and in dampness, and actually seems to be somewhat related to increased floor joist moisture as well, which is also interesting. Okay, so that's enough of some more numbers. So this was just to show how the actual climate factors that I talked about that we extracted from the CliFlow database related to, and I thought this was quite interesting, that actually 30-day rain has a noticeable impact on visible mould, which is almost a little bit surprising, but I don't know if I have time to talk about the occupants there. I hope I do. So I wanted to, the dampness outcomes are not very strongly correlated to each other, which was quite interesting to me. The most strongly correlated between the dampness outcomes was subjective damp and musty odour, which had a correlation of about 50%, and that was the highest, and everything else was less correlated than that. And so I wanted to explore that a little bit, and because of course we need to remember that these are all subjective measurements, and that the mould could be described as a semi-quantitative, but even within that, these are also point in time measures of transient effects. So that's very difficult to get good data on any of these things, which may come and go over time when you've just got a single one-off measurement. So how much can we rely on these dampness measurements at all? So these graphs here show the floor joist moisture measurement, so the one quantitative measurement that we do have, graphed against another aggregate aggregation of dampness indicators. So scored 1 for each of these outcomes. So obviously, so 2005, it doesn't look very linear, but from 2010 and 2015, you do see that with an increasing number of dampness indicators, the floor joist measured moisture is increasing. So that's reassuring a little bit, but it's still, it's still not quite as strong as you might expect. Another thing that I thought was a little bit interesting about these graphs is that these outliers don't really appear to be having a very strong influence on so these are outliers of the measured moisture are not predicting the dampness indicators. So that's a little bit interesting. Ceiling joist moisture measurement, the same, a little bit more consistency this time again. The outliers, so the extremely high measurements of moisture in the ceiling joists are not particularly related to the dampness, subjective dampness outcomes. We're digging even more deeply into the relationship between this is really a graph for the data geeks here, of which I know there's few, but could we find a dose response relationship in a univariate analysis of one of the damp or musty odor? Is it predicted by mould as a categorical variable? And in 2015, we see some nice dose response relationships with increasing extent of mould predicts increasing dampness. But here you see these R squared values, only 17 and 16% of the variance in the dampness is actually explained by that mould. So to sum up, what have I found? Well, envelope condition does appear to be an important driver. Obviously, this is an observational study, and to be really sure about that relationship, we'd need to do some kind of experiment, ideally a randomized control trial, but which would be very expensive. So luckily, hopefully the evidence that I've found here might be enough to support getting funding to do such a expensive study, but who knows. I think what I'm showing here is that having multiple moisture measurements in your study is really valuable, because each one alone does not appear to summarize the entirety of the dampness in the house. And I think likewise that having a quantitative measure alongside your non-quantitative measurements is really valuable as well. So I didn't get to talk about this, and this is something that unfortunately I couldn't explore as deeply as I like to, but the fact that rental houses appear to be more strongly associated with mould is a bit frustrating, because obviously, being a tenant can't directly cause mould. So there must be some unexplained factor that I haven't been able to address. And I suspect, because there was one of the surveys, only the 2010 survey actually had the number of occupants and the floor area of the house. And in that one, when I included both of those in the model with 10-year rental, the rental value lost significance. So I think that's worth exploring in the future. I think it's quite possible that some, or possibly even all of the relationship with mould and rental tenure might be explained by the fact that rental houses tend to be smaller with more people in them, which is shown in all the house condition surveys. Yeah, and luckily there's still some important gaps, so we don't need to stop. Thank you very much. And thanks to my supervisors and to Brands for funding my research.
So let's just have time for discussion. So that's great. And people here like Caroline with expertise in the area of mould, and some people from Brands are there. Is anyone from Brands here? Yeah. So that's really great, and lots of public health implications here. So can you please identify who you are when you're asking your question?
It's Caroline, oh, that's very loud, isn't it? Caroline Shorter, and I have done some work in mould, as Philippa said. So just wondering, how much do you think the training of the investigators at the beginning kind of improved these assessments? Because you mentioned that a couple of the things are very subjective, and I was kind of interested that they hadn't used sort of the normal dampness indicators, like do you see damp on a wall, rather than sort of feels damp, and also maybe the question order they did it. So had they already observed the underfloor moisture before they actually made that assessment?
Thanks, Caroline. I think that's a good question, and I think I don't know if I can demonstrate it quantitatively, but you know, sort of reaching into the what it appears to be showing me, I would say that the training has quite a big impact. And likewise, I think the order that the assessment is done also has a big impact. So, you know, particularly if you do mould, visible mould right at the end, you know, and they've gone around and they've looked at every detail of the house. And in fact, it's an important point about this one is that in the brand's training, mould is actually considered an aspect of the condition. So in fact, when they give a condition rating, they're thinking about partially about how mouldy it is. So I think that's a really interesting point of thought for future surveys, that those things need to be really carefully delineated. Yeah, and I think my suspicion is that everything improved in the 2015 one, that everything's more clearer, and I think that's because the training had improved and also that they were looking more carefully, you know, like for tinier pieces of mould and not just really big obvious patches. Yeah.
The only other, question I had was, why have they chosen not to do winter? Like that seems, even in 2015, it's an obvious time to kind of observe mould. So
I've talked to Vicky about that, and it's not a decision it was not a deliberate thing. Yeah, it's just how it panned out. But I'm really hoping that after looking at this, I really think that, as you did in your most recent study, Caroline, I think April through November is the only time to assess dampness and mould. And yeah.
Kia ora, I'm Neville. Thanks very much, Phoebe, for a great presentation. Gosh, there's a lot of feedback. So I guess, first of all, I really wanted to thank you, because it shows how hard it is to measure mould, and mould and damp is not one thing, it's about a dozen concepts rolled together. But I was curious as to why you chose to adjust for the highest daily temperature and the average of the high daily temperatures rather than the low.
Well, that was mainly just to do with the low temperature. Yeah, that's a good question. Now I want to go back and do it again. I think, yeah, I think I was trying to explain the seasonal difference, and that's why I went for the high one. But now that you point that out, the low temperature would have actually been really interesting too. Yeah.
Kia ora, Phoebe. I'm seeing how far away I can hold this. It's really great. I was wondering with the, Lucy from Hikaingaranga. I was wondering with the measures of the exterior condition, whether that was in some way a proxy for the likelihood that the occupants could afford to heat their homes.
I wouldn't like to say on that. It's quite possible, but one thing I've noticed in my exploration of housing quality in New Zealand is that it's just not actually that important to New Zealanders. So while I think that's probably true for some of the houses, that other people can afford it perfectly well and still don't do it. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Andrea from Public Health. I've got two questions. One is, did you factor in a heating source across the 3 samples? Because gas fires emit a lot more liquid. And there were, unflued were banned at a certain point. I don't know when that was. So I just wondered if that had an effect. They haven't. Oh, okay. So that wouldn't have had an effect. The other thing was the range hood. Did you mark the kind of range hood? Because there's 2 types. There's the ones that are externally flued and the ones that just take out the carbons, the toxins.
Right. I think I can answer both those questions. So the first one about the heaters, yes, I did break those down and look at those, the different types of heaters. And the gas type of heater, the strongest association was with sealing joist moisture. And I couldn't find a strong difference between gas heaters, whether, you know, I tried putting the fluid ones and the unfluid ones separate or together, and I didn't find a big difference. But I think a lot of that is down to the fact that doing this kind of analysis with such low numbers of your outcome variable really restricts how much you can break things down by. And whether the fluid things, again, yes, there was actually quite a few houses in the sample where the range hood was actually vented into the ceiling space, and again that was strongly associated with sealing joist moisture. And so for some of the analyses I called those houses that didn't have one, and likewise some of the drier extractions have a condenser that drips the moisture down to the subfloor, and that was associated with worst floor joist moisture. And again, I actually discounted those from being houses that actually had those things. So to summarize, I think extracting them to the exterior is actually essential for all of those ventilation factors. Yeah.
Hi Phoebe, Helen from Haikangaranga. I've got another question about range hoods, and that is, they came in about the 70s and without really being required up until almost very recently, if at all. And I'm wondering if the incredibly dramatic effect you had with range hoods might partly be a marker for house age.
I think so. There was when I broke the samples down by age, there were quite a few actually really old houses, and like has been shown in Brand's research, there's a sort of U shape between house age and condition, where the very oldest ones, which are really popular because they're the nice old style villa with all the lovely old hardwoods and have often been renovated, and so actually a lot of those older houses actually were more likely to have the range hood. So in the models were included both the range hood and the house age. Well, actually house age, I could only bin it really broadly because of the way the data was spread, and it wasn't strongly related to anything. It was strongly, although to be fair, it was strongly related to the maintenance, the overall condition.
Ask a question, as we don't have any others. I'm Hera from Hikainga-Oranga, and I was wondering, you've got a couple of earlier surveys that you obviously haven't done anything with, but I just wondered, had they been analysed at all, those surveys, and can you get any very broad historical sense of improvement in housing over the period from, I think it was 94?
Yeah. So those surveys were analysed by brands in terms of, and with their usual analyses where they look at condition by tenure. I think they did that for those earlier surveys as well. The reason we didn't include those is they didn't have fully national samples. The 2005 one, I think, was the first one that was a fully national survey. What was the second part of your question?
Yeah, sorry, I understood why you didn't include them. I just wondered if you could get any sense from the brand's analysis of a historical improvement over what would then be 25 years.
The short answer is no, there's no obvious improvement, but you can't say whether that's, you know, whether that really shows a lack of improvement or it's just that the surveys are not fully comparable. Especially that, you know, I think that the difference in survey in season is the really important one that makes the surveys not quite comparable to each other.
This is my own, actually. I was looking at the comparison between rental and owner-occupied housing, and I wondered, was there a difference in the housing condition between those two groups? Or was that not something you looked at?
Yeah, there is a big difference, and that I didn't go into that deeply because that's the main thrust of the brand's papers done by Vicky and my supervisor Mark. There's a big difference. Yeah, rental houses tend to be much poorer quality condition in individual factors and on an overall, yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions people wanted to ask? I'm going to ask one which you're quite entitled to refuse. Can you tell me how this fits into your work at MB and how much notice they're taking of these kind of things with the development of the new building code, which we hope is going to see the light of day sometime?
Right. Well, firstly, I'm working at Housing for Urban, at the Ministry for Housing and Urban Development.
Oh.
So unfortunately, we're not overseeing the changes to the
sorry.
building code.
Sorry, that's
I'd love
fine.
to be able to talk to the teams that are.
Yeah.
But it relates this work relates very closely to what I'm doing for HUD at the moment, which is
Can you talk about that then?
Yes. So I'm analysing the next iteration of the same survey, which is the pilot housing survey, which is quite exciting because this time it's been linked with the general social survey. So it has a whole lot of other questions for every single house. It's a slightly bigger sample as well. And so we've got some of the behavioural stuff and we can get a bit more of the detail. Unfortunately, it still was done a lot over the summer. But yeah, so it's very closely related to what I'm doing there.
Our group contributed some of the monitors that I think this time there's independent measures, aren't there? Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Brands hasn't given me access to those the measurements yet, so because they're special. But we'll see if we can. But the GSS included a single temperature assessment.
Yeah.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I haven't actually looked at that yet, but I'm looking forward to that. I know Rosemary's done a little analysis of that and shown that it was related to season. So that's a start.
Yeah. Well, if we have no other questions and none online, I think your work shows the real value of a first-class piece of research, which raises as many questions as it answers. And I think it's great that you're now working in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development and able to fertilise those ideas there. And hopefully we'll have some links through with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And when you're looking at doing some of those community trials, come back and talk to us.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Yeah. If I want to do a randomised control trial, you'll be the first person.
Yes, and
ask for advice.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important area. I know Rosemary Goodyear at the Statistics New Zealand is just doing a report on housing in New Zealand, and I think most of us would have found something about that presentation. It's sort of about range hoods or drying clothes or as used to be the case, a young American colleague of mine said, I can't understand New Zealanders. And in America, they would all paint their house over the summer, and New Zealanders just work out that they want to go to the Cook Islands or something and, and consider the overseas holidays more important than doing up the house. So maybe as nobody can travel now, we'll start to see less deferred maintenance.
I would really love to see that.
Could you join with me in thanking Phoebe?
Thank you very much.